Well, thank you. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, all of you here, for having me out here tonight. I will tell you right up front, ladies and gentlemen, that I turned down 90% of requests to speak. I'd rather go off and just do work or something. I'm here because I owe this organization. It's one of fewer, by the way, than a handful of organizations that I feel this sense of gratitude for. It's also an honor to be here because, frankly, after some of those statements I've made in public, it's an honor to be invited to any polite company anymore to speak at all. So it's really a pleasure to be out here with you. Humbled to receive this award. Ben Franklin, for all of us, when we were boys and girls, were brought up on this man. His influence is still with us, of course. And when you think of him as the first citizen of Philadelphia and how he directed his energies toward public service and development of individual character, well, I come from an organization that for 40 years has devoted me to public service, and my sergeants on more than one occasion helped develop my individual character in their usual persuasive manner. So I come with a great deal of common background as Ben Franklin, although I'm not quite as old as he is. I'm getting there, though. I also can't come to FPRI without a sense of gratitude. Seriously, ladies and gentlemen, when you go into public service and you get to the level where 100-hour work weeks are the short weeks, your next original thought is your first. To put it bluntly, you need other people to be doing a lot of the thinking. You're simply pouring out all of your energy, all of your thinking, all of your learning, all that people have given you over the years and trying to get through each week. And so we need an organization like FPRI. One, as Jack said earlier, is one with a keen interest in our country and America's future. And you need them because any organization dedicated to the proposition that a country, America, must think before it acts is critical, especially in transition times when the old rules no longer apply. They don't say we should think. They don't say we could think. They say we must think before we act. And I will tell you, having commanded 25,000 sailors and Marines going into an operation that we pulled down a statue and then had to do a fair amount of figuring out what to do next, I think that the proposition that guides FPRI is one that is more relevant today than ever before. I like, too, that FPRI is very comfortable with the free competition of ideas. As Alan said, he doesn't agree with everything that his scholars come up with. I don't agree with myself all the time. But it's critical that we have people who are willing to challenge what some people call conventional wisdom and are willing to put it on the line like that with the degree of rigor and discipline and yet unregimented thinking that I experienced here. My staff knew every time Orbis was printed, they were to highlight it and get it into me as fast as it came in through the mail, because that was where we would often find our refreshing new ideas historically grounded for how we were going to deal with a region. And you heard some of the nations I dealt with there, from the Mediterranean, Lebanon, and Egypt, through Jordan and Iraq, Syria, on into the Persian Gulf area, from Yemen to Iran, from Pakistan up into central Siberia. I once was asked by someone I said sir to, even as a 4-star. He said, "Jim, do you know why you have this job?" And I said, "Well, no, sir, I wondered about it." He says, "Because we could find no one else who wanted the job." And it says something because it's ideas that come out of reflective organizations like this that allow people like me then to have some way of dealing with the realities that we dealt with in a Middle East that's going through an awful lot of turmoil. We live in an age right now, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not allowed to take questions tonight, by the way, which is really my favorite part. So please tell Phoebe that I did my best without the Q&A here, Mr. and Mrs. Novakovic. And if any of you decide to turn off your listening before I get done talking, maybe you could just stand up and interrupt me, and we'll go to questions and answers, and we'll have a little anarchy here, which Dave Dinello promises us is the wave of the future anyway, so you might as well just get on to it. But I would tell you that right now, ladies and gentlemen, with Cold War rules going out the window, with power diffusing beyond national power structures, nation states, with increased impact of the information age only now becoming fully manifested in many of the aspects of foreign policy. And terrorism today, we're witnessing a few zealots, a few crackpots can actually murder on an industrial scale. It's obvious we need to change some of our thinking. And we need the new thinking, and if, as Nadia Shadlow has convincingly, I think, stated, if we are engaged in a global argument right now about the values that our band was just singing about on the stage, if we're going to engage in this global argument, we're going to need fresh definitions of the strategic problem that we face and fresh solutions in order to deal with that, solutions that marry our time. I think that FPRI can draw the best and the brightest, not only from inside its own ranks, but from elsewhere, because its reputation is so strong. And I have personally shanghaied and hijacked a number of their ideas and not always given credit to the FPRI as I employed them in various capitals around the world as we try to keep this experiment that you and I call America alive and vibrant. The first citizen of Philadelphia certainly stayed engaged. That's why I think it's appropriate FPRI be engaged here. I'll tell you that their engagement has an awful lot of people identifying with the ideas that come out of this organization. And for those of you who support it, I hope that you will continue to do so, having for about the last 6 years been directly engaged in using their ideas around the world. Remember that Ben Franklin didn't let his youth or his old age change the fact that he was going to make a difference. And I think that if you look at Margaret Mead's point that we should never underestimate or overestimate, I think it is, what a small group of committed people can do to change the world. In fact, in the history of the world, it's the only thing that's changed the world. I think we need to keep this sort of vibrant organization at the top of its game. Let me talk for a few minutes. I'm supposed to share reflections as a combatant commander. First of all, what a combatant commander does, I commanded about 220,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Coast Guard, Marines. They're engaged in active operations. You've heard of a place like Iraq, now done, for us anyway, Afghanistan, obviously Lebanon, that unfortunate little country with some tough neighbors, down into Egypt with its own problems right now, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and all. And as you deal with these kinds of countries, you're dealing with both political and military issues, obviously. And in that regard, it's absolutely critical that our ideas not be just narrowly defined as military, and then we move to another avenue, narrowly defined as foreign policy. What Nadia Shadlow, who joined us here tonight, calls the total mix of everything we do, that's our foreign policy, and that's where I fit within the larger policy of our country in reinforcing what was going on from our State Department. I first sailed into those waters, ladies and gentlemen, in 1979. You want to interrupt me?
I hurt my leg.
Oh, I was hoping I was getting interrupted here, and Alan, we are going to break free. You stay standing, sir. Come on up if you want to give the speech, too. It might improve it. But I first sailed into the waters. I was an infantry company commander on a Navy amphib. It was 1979. I've spent most of my life dealing with the Middle East ever since. Had I realized then I was going to be staying out there that much, I probably would have found a different line of work because it was a rather strange part of the world. A point to really emphasize right here, the Middle East problems did not start with 9/11. They didn't start with the rise of the modern state of Israel. They did not start with the Arab Spring. All of these are more recent inputs into a region that had a very rich culture, a tumultuous history for a long time, and it's the most tumultuous I've seen it in my entire time since 79. As I read history, it's certainly the most tumultuous since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And it's not going to get better anytime soon. I think that's important to understand. And part of the reason is just, if you look at the Arab Spring alone, what are you actually seeing? It's very important that we look at it for what it is, not for what you and I hope it would be. It is not, it never was a pell-mell rush to democracy. If you remove Cairo, 2011 and replace it with the words Paris 1789, you'll be able to find the same human impulses echoing across the centuries, showing the breakdown of the social contract between the government and the governed, people fed up with unresponsive, unjust governments. Yes, in 2011 it was amplified by information technology, but the same human impulses, as I say, we've had it and we're done with this. They rose up, they got rid of what they had, but remember what follows the French Revolution. It's Napoleon. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a methodical march into democracy. It was never that sort of thing. It was an anti-something. It wasn't necessarily directed towards democracy. And while many of us in this room agree with many Arabs who want democracy, it's probably not going to be a short spring. In other words, if an Arab Spring follows this long winter they've been through of many decades, it's doubtful that that spring will be over in a season, in an annual season. It's not going to be that way. It's going to be a while, and if we look at our own rather torturous history in the West towards democracy, it can take a long time. There will be setbacks along the way. We shouldn't exaggerate those setbacks, but we should not expect a smooth cruising straight into a democratic Middle East. They do not have the tradition of democracy, and they do not have many of the things that you and I associate with the rule of law in the recent past. I think you should watch Egypt very closely. Remember, a third of the Arab peoples live in Egypt. They are the traditional leader in terms of science and learning, in culture and religion. I think that after watching the Muslim Brotherhood come to power and basically commit political suicide in the country and enraging the Egyptian people, and we had the largest public demonstrations in modern history, basically publicly impeach the Muslim Brothers, and then the military muscle moved them out. What we have to watch for in this setback on the road to democracy is, can the military get those elections back on track? Will they be on the timeline and keep the process going toward democracy there? And how Egypt goes, ladies and gentlemen, will have a lot to do with how the Middle East goes in the future, so it bears watching. There's a lot of skeptics who are going to point to the fact that, you see, the Arab Spring can't amount to anything good. And I wouldn't go that far. In the short term, ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be setbacks. That's just a reality. Each country is going to manifest its future in its own way. Just like we're different from Canada to our north and Mexico to our south, the countries that are adjacent to each other in the Middle East are all very, very different as well. So they'll each find their own path forward. But let me give you one example of why I remain hopeful in the mid to longer term. If I was here 3 years ago and you asked me about Yemen, I would tell you you probably have one of the most unfortunate little countries with the most dismal future possible. Yemen, in the last 2.5 years, has gotten rid of a dictator who had governed the country for 30 years. They did it in the face of significant poverty. They did it in the face of terrible environmental factors. They have enormous numbers, hundreds of thousands of refugees from Africa. They don't even try to hold their borders. There's not even an effort made along those lines. Meanwhile, they have a separatist movement. They have the Houthi Shia insurgency, and they have al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a murderous group that's attacked America. And Iran is helping all three of those last groups. And in the midst of that, they ran an election. They removed Saleh. They put in place an elected leader. Their army took advantage of al-Qaeda, making a strategic mistake in trying to hold ground, and with help from others have beaten them back. And today, they are undergoing a national dialogue to try to bring people together. So at the time when the skeptics are so critical of any possible good coming out of this, I think it's way too early to say that it's automatically going to go either towards democracy or toward a disaster. That's not the case. A lot of decisions, a lot of leadership is going to be exercised to see which way this turns out. I would tell you that there is still the room for optimism, but we have to be realistic about what's going on. And as we look at the realistic aspects of our foreign policy out there, you have to ask, what are the enduring American interests? I mean, why do we care? We're talking in Philadelphia tonight, And yet anyone who's been reading about our energy supplies in North America, from Mexico to Canada to the United States, can say probably by 2017, certainly by 2020, we will be largely energy independent. So why do we care about the Middle East? And I would give you 3 enduring interests for why we need to continue to care. We'll have to watch, number one, the energy situation and see if it manifests the way we anticipate. There's certainly some room for skepticism there. No matter what, even if we're totally energy independent, the price at the pump of a worldwide traded commodity like energy is going to be set out of the Middle East. That's a reality. And we're tied to that global economy. So the idea that we could somehow turn our back on the price of oil and it has no effect on our economy is simply faulty. The second reason why I think we have enduring interest are our friends and allies in the region. FDR met with the King of Saudi Arabia in Bitter Lake in 1944. The Israelis have stood by us. Let me give you the example of Jordan. The King of Jordan assured me one night, about a year ago, as I was meeting with him, that his soldiers would remain in Afghanistan until the last American soldier comes home. Now, you cannot buy allies with that level of commitment. You have to be a friend and an ally to them to get that sort of commitment back. And it's not the only country in the region that's allied with us. United Arab Emirates, a country that we in the military call Little Sparta for their valiant stands alongside us, been with us in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. They were with us in Somalia. They were with us in Kosovo and Bosnia. They were with us against Libya. And in Afghanistan, as some of our traditional allies last year started to bring down the numbers of their troops in Afghanistan, where 50 nations fight alongside each other, the United Arab Emirates, knowing that I would have to turn once again to the U.S. Army, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy to bring in more, United Arab Emirates sent in more special forces and more fighter aircraft to help take up the load from the Americans. Now, the point I'm making is you can't be a friend only in good times. We're going to have to stand by those guys out there when they face tough times, just like they've stuck with us. You can't be a friend only when in the good, fair weather days. So, price of oil, our friends and allies in the region, and the third one is the violent extremists. We all know that 2 airplane rides out of the Middle East and someone with some very bad designs can be here in this country. We know how quickly people operating out of Afghanistan can attack the cities north and south of you, New York and Washington, D.C., and make it a reality. So the idea that we're just going to play defense back here and not stay engaged forward, again, I think is simply not accepting the reality of a globalized world. So I think as we look at this sort of a situation right now, you have to say, okay, so what is our policy out there? I've actually had the question asked of me by several people tonight. And I think that the best way to address this is give you the guiding principles of the State Department, those principles that guided me in my use of the U.S. military forces. First of all, we support each country's political reform at its own pace. We don't tell them how to do it. They have got to reform. They're all reforming, some faster than others, some under violent conditions, many with elections and that sort of thing, many in the middle. But we do support political reform at each country's own pace. Second, we support economic reform so more countries believe that more people in the body politic believe that they actually have some ownership of the future, some hope for the future. The third guiding principle is we support a re-energized Middle East peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And you see Secretary Kerry working zealously at this. I only hope the protagonists are as committed as he is right now. But this is a problem. The status quo, ladies and gentlemen, is not sustainable, and we should not turn this problem over to our children. We should address this in our time. The fourth guiding principle is the one that really is where I was most engaged, and that is we support our friends and allies in the region against violent extremists and against any bellicose nation. And there's one with external designs. You know who it is. It's Iran, and every morning when I woke up, I had three primary considerations: Iran and Iran and Iran. That's what I woke up to each day as the commander of Central Command. And I bring this up, ladies and gentlemen, because we ran those sanctions against the Iranians, the European Union and the Americans, and coalescing the effort there as a way to get them to the negotiating table. And I think we're doing exactly the right thing by negotiating, but at the same time we're going to have modest expectations on a country that has used deceit and denial for years about their nuclear weapons program. They are enriching uranium beyond any peaceful purpose. That's a reality. Now, how do we deal with it? You know what both Republican and Democrat administrations have said in America, that we will not tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran. So absent a war, your only alternative is to negotiate, and that's what we're engaged in now. And I wish our negotiators well. I would just tell you that there were other things we did, obviously, on a daily basis: protect the embassies, execute active operations in some areas. We went after the enemies that we confront in a very strong way. But at times your military was engaged in nothing more than buying time for diplomats. I'll give you an example. You may all recall 2-3 years ago, you used to hear a lot about Iran was going to mine the waters. Remember the Persian Gulf, the Strait, they were going to put mines in the water. And so we figured out what we would do is run a international counter-mine exercise centered around the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Now, it was not a counter-Iran exercise. It's counter whoever wanted to put mines in the water, okay? This just shows that even a Marine infantryman can be politically nuanced, all right? So we thought, well, maybe we'll get about a dozen nations out there. Maybe about, our traditional allies, Britain, France, they'll be with us, of course. A couple other NATO nations, maybe a few other nations there in the region. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, that sort of thing. We ended up in the first one that we ran with 29 nations from every continent except Antarctica. And I was looking for a penguin to get them on board as well. It included nations like Canada and Estonia, Japan, Singapore, Djibouti. You see what I'm driving at. These were not nations that are known for being bellicose or something like that. And only the American Navy could have drawn that many nations together and given some kind of substance and format to that kind of a very complex organization trying to do one of the toughest things you can ever do at sea, and that's remove mines. Since that time, we ran another one, by the way, and got 35 nations the next year. Since that time, you've heard very little out of Tehran about mining the waters. There are ways for your military to calm things down and give the diplomats time before the Iranians had made a grievous miscalculation, drop mines in the water with the impact on our oil trade and certainly on the prospects for war. And I bring that up because sometimes, the Iranians will say, we don't want any Americans out here, we don't need them. The local governments in the region know darn good and well why the Iranians want us out of there, and this is exactly why we stay engaged out in this region. And when you look back at our enduring interests, I think you can see the number one reason that we stay engaged is not leave them high and dry with a bellicose Iran that's trying to come up with nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. The biggest challenge I faced out there, ladies and gentlemen, was they doubted today our reliability as an ally. As one Mideast leader put it, General, I hear that the military option's on the table. It must be a very long table, because I got out my binoculars and looked down that table and I couldn't see the military option. And I reminded him that there are other people who have miscalculated in this world, guys named Toho and Hitler, who he ought to be very, very careful about doubting whether or not the Americans will be there if this thing goes south on us. So there is a lot of question, and most of the questioning right now has to do with America's internal functioning. They believe a country that cannot govern itself, that cannot keep its own government running, cannot tell the rest of the world that it can remain engaged. They doubt whether or not a country that is on a fiscally unsustainable path can continue to maintain a military, because they recognize that reality, that our military's engine is our national economy. That's how you keep a military at the top of its game. So one of the best ways, I think, to prevent any kind of future war, or at least reduce the chance of it, is to have a good economic recovery in this country and have the country's government on an economically sustainable budget that somehow we can pass each year and show that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, this experiment that you and I inherited, has not lost its way. Now, in the midst of all this, I can tell you that your military can buy time, and we will buy time. There's not one of us wearing the uniform who didn't feel that we had let you down on 9/11. And so we went back out there. It was a personal fight for us, and we intended to do a lot of damage, and we've done a lot of damage to the enemy. But at the same time, there's two brands of terrorism. There's one that declared war on us in the 80s, Lebanese Hezbollah. They come from the Shia brand. They're supported by Iran. They attacked the French paratrooper barracks in Beirut and the U.S. Marine peacekeeper barracks there. They've basically been unscathed. They killed Prime Minister Hariri in Lebanon. They stillborn the Lebanese Cedar Revolution. This is all Iran's doing. They're the ones fighting alongside Assad today. And they're the ones who have murdered Saudi Arabian diplomats and Israeli tourists in Bulgaria. And they've gotten away basically with murder is the bottom line. On the other hand, there's Al-Qaeda. They attacked us. We made certain that an awful lot of Al-Qaeda leaders will not collect their 401k retirement plans. And they've been hurt, but they have not been completely put out of business. And I think that right now we have to look at continuing what we're doing in a more in a strategically modified way. If you want to see how the military will buy the time as our country gets its act back together, as America becomes more unified again, I would refer you to Dr. Corey Shockey, who joins us here tonight. Her idea about it's going to look like the constant skirmishing of the U.S. cavalry against the American Indian 1850 to 1900. Constant skirmishes. Let's not give up more of our constitutional civil rights. Don't exaggerate this enemy, but don't patronize them either. When they say girls don't go to school, when they say everybody prays this way, they actually believe they can impose that. So we're going to have to deal with it. It's irreconcilable with our way of life. But there is a way, if you look back at that model of the U.S. Army and the American Indian in the Western Plains and Southwest, there's a model that we can seize upon if we do a little bit more study on it. You move from there to David Dinello's idea that anarchy is the new normal, and what you're seeing is this is the call for defining to a Jesuit's level of satisfaction, if I may, what is the problem we're up against, okay? And whether Dave Dinello is right or wrong, we're going to have to organize to defeat this enemy. And it's going to come in some form of an anarchy where nation states are not the only enemy. If you move from Corey's view of how the military should organize to carry out the military campaign to buy time to Dave Dinello's view of the future, and then you go to Nadia Shadlow's idea that that's good the military can buy time, but it can't solve the problem. It'll win military campaigns and military battles. Then you move next to how do you organize the totality of American foreign policy in the same way that the CIA and the military are organized to compete against others. And if you get that part right, if you get our education programs, if you get our information programs and our foreign policy and our organization right, then you can actually start organizing to compete in what she calls a global argument. And we shouldn't stop there. I'd take it one step further. And if you look at what Jim Hake has done, who joined us here tonight, with Spirit of America, this is where we take entrepreneurial spirit and private money and you use it as venture capital, and you actually allow this NGO, non-governmental organization, that is unapologetically not neutral. They're on our side. They decided they're going to take America's side in this fight, and I salute them for it. The Spirit of America, they've been a godsend to me when I'm trying to get sheikhs in Iraq to come over to our side. Between you and I don't care about swords. I don't like swords. They're pretty little knives, you know. But when you hand an Arab sheikh a sword and say the war is over, we're now on the same side, and they join you, that's not something I can use American taxpayer dollars for. That's not right. That's something that they give us the money from private industry to go out and do something like that. We declare peace, and now for the next 7 months, their boys who are fighting alongside Al-Qaeda are now guiding our boys in on their rally points, and we're having a very lucrative time in the fight. It's how we go from Corey Shockey's view of the American military campaign to Dave Dinello's strategic concept, to Nadia Shadlow's how do you organize for it, to Jim Hake's point about how you bring together the American entrepreneurial spirit and take it all together against the enemy and for this experiment again called America. If I could just ask you four to please stand for a moment. I know where you're sitting, so don't hide on me here. Nadia, you too. All of you stand, please. Where's Dave? Dave's around here somewhere too. Anyway, thanks very much, and I told you I was opportunistic, so I take advantage of good ideas wherever I find them, and I deeply appreciate it. It says something about FPRI that in one evening they would draw people from the West Coast, from Hoover Institution and Spirit of America, and from Washington, D.C., and bring them here. It's about the drawing card here. I was supposed to end on a high note, ladies and gentlemen. Now, when you deal with the Middle East, you understand that's a little bit of a challenge, okay? But let me just tell you this. You can't end on a higher note than when you speak to the veterans who fought for this country, who signed that blank check payable to the American people with their lives. And just to show you that those veterans, their legacy lives on, and it's a much stronger force for good than is any bloviating general's talk. One night, we'd been told to attack a town called Fallujah. I went down there, have about a half dozen basically radio operators around me, and I went down to see the assault battalions before they would attack the next morning. I was done. I reviewed their plans. They were ready to go. It was about midnight, time for generals to get out of the way and leave it in the hands of the very, very young infantrymen. And they're called infantrymen, ladies and gentlemen, infant soldier, young soldier for a reason. And as we were walking back, the enemy created some mischief very nearby, so I got my guys down there and I checked in with the corporal. I said, we're going to wait here until it calms down. He said, no sweat, General, this just take a few minutes. And this was a company that would attack about an hour before dawn to take out the enemy outpost so the rest of the battalion, of the assault battalion, could move up. And very, very cold. The boys are stripped down to their combat gear. They're shivering, laying on the ground, and for more than just because of the cold. And after everything calmed down, we just sat there for a minute to hear, make sure it was all quiet again. And one of the very young Marines asked his corporal, who was probably not old enough to drink alcoholic beverages, at least legally, he asked him, he says, you think Fallujah is going to be real bad in the morning? These are boys going into their first fight, except for the corporal. And we have ladies present here, so I'm not going to put it in quite the same words the corporal put it. But he basically said, hush and get some rest. We took Iwo Jima. Fallujah won't be nothing. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll just tell you, that's because of our veterans who have fought for this country before. That was worth more than any speech that I could have given those boys. And to all of you who are veterans, just from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the award tonight. I was just in the right place at the right time. My boys did all the heavy lifting, and that's not false modesty. I accept it because you were a big help to us. I accept it for them and because of them. And I would just say, let's have the legacy of Ben Franklin live on. I hope you all stay engaged, and long live the United States of America. Thank you.